Class, now we come to the final batch of selection techniques covered in this unit. Work simulations class. These are selection techniques that, unlike interviews and unlike tests, are meant to simulate or approximate the work environment as closely as possible. Yeah. So first, I'll introduce you to the concept of work simulations and draw distinctions between high fidelity and low fidelity simulations. Class fidelity meaning faithfulness. Yeah. How faithful is the work simulation to the actual job duties, job tasks, job context, job environment, etc. Yeah, some of these simulations will be more similar to the actual job. Some will be a little bit more abstracted, less similar, less faithful. Yeah, but they still have their place and they still have their function. We'll cover 4 types of work simulations: work samples, assessment centers, which are covered in the TOOT for this week as well, situational judgment tests, and lastly, job tryouts. When I think of work simulations class, I come back to this funny tongue-in-cheek example from the show House, MD. You may remember this show. It ran maybe 8-9 years ago, maybe longer. And it's basically like, what if Sherlock Holmes were a doctor trying to diagnose diseases in the way that Sherlock Holmes would solve crimes, yeah? And House tried to recruit his next batch of assistants using something like a reality show, like a Survivor, something on the Survivor, where he got 40 doctors, gave them all a number, so 1 to 40, and he had them do the job, and he would slowly fire people who didn't seem to be doing the job well or who weren't a quote-unquote good fit, yeah, which is not exactly great selection practice, but that aside. He would slowly winnow down the pool of 40 people who were doing the job, and he eventually managed to keep 3. Yeah. So this actually, class, is a job tryout where what you would do is you would have job candidates do the job, and then you keep some and don't keep the others. Yeah. So as silly as this may have appeared on TV, yeah, this actually has some basis as a genuine selection technique. So, work simulations class are assessments that present applicants with realistic job-related situations. Once again, class, whenever we get the definition, we break it down. First, it is an assessment. So, just like your tests, yeah, your cognitive ability tests, your personality tests, your interviews, just like all of these things, there is meant to be a sort of scoring scheme. Yeah, there is a systematic attempt to measure something about the applicant. Yeah. Now, the way this does this, the way simulations try to score applicants is on the basis of how they respond to realistic job-related situations. Now, some aspects of previous selection techniques are also kind of like this. You'll remember the selection interview. Yeah, fairly similar as well. Here, however, we are aiming for realism, yeah, as much as possible. And some simulations are more realistic than others. We refer to the realism of the assessment technique as the fidelity, yeah, faith, yeah. So how faithful is this to the actual job? So a high fidelity simulation class would use real materials and scenarios from work and expose job candidates to real job demands, yeah, much like the job tryouts that House ran in season 4 of House. Yeah. Then you have lower fidelity selection techniques, lower fidelity simulations that simply present hypothetical scenarios to job candidates and ask, what would you do? And I'll cover a couple examples of this as we proceed. So, higher fidelity simulations would be things like job tryouts and work samples. And then on the lower fidelity end, you have your situational judgment tests. They still do simulate work in ways that will be clear when you see the examples, but it is a lot less real. Yeah, it's a lot less visceral than the other approaches. So, work simulations class have pretty good predictive validity, pretty good criterion validity. What does that mean? Let me refresh your memory, class. This means that how well a job candidate does on the work simulation is pretty good at predicting criteria such as subsequent job performance, subsequent teamwork, subsequent managerial skills, especially, yeah, etc. One thing about work simulations class is that they have great face validity. Again, recap. Face validity class is the applicant reaction to the selection tool. So, take the perspective of the applicant. You're going through the selection process. Some of the things that the organization does to select you will seem more legitimate than others, yeah? As we've covered in previous weeks, personality tests are particularly come across as illegitimate. They particularly come across as not a very fair way to select workers, yeah? To select job candidates for a job, yeah? Now, work simulations don't have this problem. They have excellent face validity. Yeah, so applicants go through work simulations and they feel like any judgment based on this is fair. Yeah, more so than other selection techniques, specifically testing. Now, work simulations also go very nicely with other selection tools. Yeah, they gel together with these other tools for a couple of reasons. First is they are harder to fake. Yeah, so unlike other selection tools that are kind of open to being faked, it's pretty hard to fake whether or not you can, say, operate a ventilator. Yeah? If you can do that simple task, if you can demonstrate that, if you don't know how to do it, it is very difficult to fake. Second, it is much more closely linked to actual work behaviors, yeah? So where, for example, interview performance may not necessarily match how the person presents themselves on the job day by day by day, a work simulation would get closer. Now, there are downsides, class, to work simulations. Naturally, the big one is that they are expensive. Yeah, expensive in terms of time, expensive in terms of money, expensive in terms of the staff requirement to run and coordinate a work simulation. And in the specific case of assessment centers, class, it also requires space, a lot of space for assessment centers. The other problem is that they only test a few KSAOs at a time. You can't run a work simulation that tests everything at once, with perhaps the exception of the job tryout. Yeah, but that aside, generally, work simulations test a few things at a time. So you can't, for example, treat it the way you treat an interview, where you can assess a whole bunch of KSAOs with different interview questions. Not really, yeah? And not every job is suited to work simulations, for reasons that will become clear. One thing that isn't on the slide, but I do want to point out, is work simulations can often be difficult to run with multiple people at a time. Yeah, assessment centers you can run with maybe 6 to 12 at a time. 12 is pushing it a little bit, but you generally would not have too many people going through work simulations in one go. So it also is, if you have a large applicant pool, it can be particularly costly to use work simulations. So there are 4 types that we'll cover in this unit. Naturally, class, there are more out there, but here we cover the basics that are typically used. Yeah, these are work samples, assessment centers, SJTs, and job tryouts. I don't think job tryouts are covered in the textbook. Yeah, so I think so. Just like with the other lectures, there's information in here that's not in the textbook. The textbook is. It's a good textbook, don't get me wrong, but every textbook is 5 to 10 years out of date by default. Yeah, just the time it takes to write a book, the time it takes for research to come out and get published. Basically, every textbook is at best half a decade behind the state of evidence. Yeah. So, for example, the textbook that you're using doesn't cover social media in selection techniques, yeah, which is now it is gaining some popularity, although it isn't really that effective. More on that as we proceed with the unit. So, work samples class are basically samples of what would be done at work. Yeah, so performing the activities that are physically or mentally similar to work tasks. So the most common example of this is the role play. Yeah, if you apply for many medium to high stakes customer service jobs, there will be some element of role playing with a customer, role playing with a difficult customer, say over the phone. Fairly common selection technique. Yeah, you can also, in some instances, like for medical work, for mining work, you may be asked to practice using equipment. Yeah, there are also presentations. So for teaching jobs, we are asked to present in order to demonstrate that we can hold ourselves in front of a classroom, etc., etc. Yeah, and for IT jobs, computer science type jobs, there will be coding. Yeah, they'll be asked to code. They'll be given problems to solve on the fly in the interview, and there's a whole tradition of people collating all the coding exercises that get asked in like job interviews for say Google or other places, and practicing before they rock up to the job interviews. Articles, other documented evidence of prior performance also count as work samples. So basically, it's a sample of what work would be. A work sample would be very specific and tailored to the job itself. So what a work sample would be for a nurse would look very different from what a work sample would be for, say, a photographer. Yeah, it is, unlike interviews, it is dramatically and systematically different from job to job. Yeah, and often these things are solicited in the recruitment and selection process, but it isn't called a work sample. It's just like, show us your portfolio. Yeah, give us an example of an article you've written, published, etc. Yeah. So this slide here has a couple of nice examples of what work samples could look like for a broad range of jobs. I'll leave you to look through this in your own time. Now, work samples class have pretty solid validity coefficients. What do these mean? Again, reminder, this is how strong the relationship is between the quality of the work sample and the criterion, which is usually task performance. Yeah, so people who have good work samples typically do well on the job. Yeah. Now, once again, you can square this number to learn what percent of the person-to-person difference in job performance is explained by the candidate-to-candidate difference in the quality of their work samples. Yeah, and 0.54 squared is, I don't have a calculator in front of me, but rough approximation, let's say 30.30. Yeah, so about 30% of the variance or of the difference in performance is explained by how well people did on their work samples. Now, work samples tend to have pretty low adverse impact. Yeah, adverse impact again is whether there are subgroup differences in how well people score on the selection tool. So there aren't many meaningful differences to speak of. Yeah, and like I said before, it's very face valid. Applicants see work samples as a very legitimate way to choose a candidate. It's difficult to fake, yeah, possible. It depends very much on how the work sample is solicited, class, but generally it's difficult to fake, not always. Naturally, use your judgment, yeah. A photography portfolio could, in principle, be faked, right? More so than how well people do on operating a drill press, yeah, for example. Work samples are high fidelity, and in addition, class, one great thing about a work sample is they offer a realistic job preview. We're going to come back to this concept in week 10 when week 9, when we talk about recruitment. Yeah, so when we talk about recruitment in week 9, we will come back to the notion of realistic job previews, in which one of the things that job candidates really like when they go through a recruitment and selection process is getting a clear sense of what exactly does this job entail. Yeah. Now, work samples serve this dual function of not only assessing how well people can potentially do the job, yeah, whether they possess the relevant KSAO, but also it gives the job candidate a sense of, oh, so this is what I will have to do on the job, and they can kind of make a more reasoned and informed judgment of whether this job is right for them. Yeah, and you want that as an HR officer. You want that as a manager. You want someone who thinks the job suits them. Yeah. Now, there are a couple of cons. The first is that a work sample provides little insight into future potential, I should say. So, unlike cognitive ability tests, where, as you'll recall from week 4, cognitive ability tests are especially good at predicting performance way down the track, several years later, or even just a couple years later, where people have had the opportunity to learn on the job and really grow. Cognitive tests are great at capturing that. Work samples, not so much. So, in kind of the same way that we have some selection techniques that are more past-looking and some that are more future-looking, work samples are more past-looking. This is what I can do, not so much what I can potentially do in the future. Yeah. So to get insight into that, you'd need cognitive ability tests, especially. Yeah. So because of this, it isn't that suited to entry-level jobs. Yeah, where people will need to be trained and will need experience on the job in order to make their maximal contribution to the organization. Yeah, they're just not there yet. They need training, they need experience, and work samples aren't really suited to getting the right people for these jobs. Yeah. Now, also the KSAOs are pretty narrow. They are narrow to the specific skill that is being tested. Yeah, like basic clinical skills for nurses, how well they can handle this with a patient or a dummy. Yeah, so these are relatively narrow. In many instances, not all class, but in many instances, they are pretty narrow. And naturally, they can't be done for every, but generally, work samples are best suited to tasks that can be done quickly. Now, we